Northrend Beasts, the first boss of Trial of the Crusader. This is definitely a comfortable greeting to the raid. It consists of 3 phases, with phase 1 being Gormock, the second phase being Acidmaw and dreadscale, and finally the last phase being Icehowl. Each phase has completely different mechanics to the previous phase, and none of these mechanics carry over, so essentially it's like fighting 3 completely different but short boss fights. Firstly, starting with group composition, you'll need 2 tanks, 4 to 5 healers, and a mix of DPS. Range definitely have an easier time here depending on how you handle phase 2, but we'll get to that shortly. I do want to put it out there straight away that this guide is aimed at everyone. It doesn't matter whether you've got full 99 passing DPS in your raid, or your whole raid is on the opposite end of the scale. As long as you can beat enraged timers, you'll be just fine. When you finally get through all of the RP, phase 1 starts and the boss walks through the doors. Your tank will want to turn him round where he starts and have its back to the raid. The ranged and healers will want to spread loosely in a semicircle around the boss. Make sure your healers are central though, so they can reach the whole raid. The reason you're spreading is for the first mechanic we'll talk about, the snowballs. These things are mega annoying and the boss will periodically throw one at a random target. You should only ever get 4 of these, and they do roughly come in every quarter of the boss's health. The first thing you want to do if you've got one on you is move into melee. These snowballs do 3 things. They throw firebombs at a random target, which will also hit everyone within 8 yards. This is why it's important you all spread at least 8 yards apart and have your range checker on. They do a 2-second stun, which is called head crack, and an attack called batter, which will interrupt spellcasting for 5 seconds, as well as causing a bit of damage. It's important to focus these down as soon as one appears and the target moves into melee range. You cannot cleave onto these from the boss, but you can cleave onto the boss from the snowballed. So while they're in melee being focused, anyone who can cleave can at least keep some damage on the boss whilst also killing the snowballed. You want everybody in your raid to switch to these to delete them as soon as physically possible. The main reason is because if you have a couple of these up and they're on your tank healers as an example, your tanks will likely die. And the reason for this leads us nicely onto the second mechanic, which is impale. Impale is a heavy bleed that stacks on the tank. For this reason, you want to have at least 2 tanks. You could use 3, but largely unnecessary. Your tanks will want to swap on 3 stacks, and you want to go into the next phase with no bleeds up on your tank. The way you handle this is a tank will take 3 stacks, then tank B will taunt and he will take 3 stacks. Tank B won't be tanking the boss again most likely, so he can receive a hand of protection from a paladin, or he can bubble himself if he's a paladin tank. Also, if you're Alliance and you're a dwarf, you can always use Stoneform. When tank A finishes tanking the boss for the second time and you're now transitioning into the second phase, he'll now be bopped to clear the bleed as well. If for some reason your DPS is lower and you're going to have 4 occasions the tanks are taking the bleed debuff, just heal through the first and second set and use bops on the third and fourth. There is one more mechanic, which is staggering stomp. If you're within 15 yards of the boss and cast him when staggering stomp goes off, you'll be silenced for 8 seconds. This is why it's important all ranged are at ranged, but not max ranged. Anything just over 15 yards is fine. Also, just a note, if you're a holy paladin, for example, like me, you like to be on top of the boss to always be getting mana back. Whilst it's possible, it's dangerous. It requires a bit more coordination from your melee and people bringing the snowballs in, because you will not want snowballs anywhere near you. Because it's not just the target whose head they're on that they'll kick and that they'll stun. It can be you as well, just for standing near them. So not only will you have to contend with making sure that you cancel your cast before a staggering stomp, you also need to make sure that the snowballs are being taken nowhere near you. So it's probably just not worth it. But once the boss is dead, clean up any remaining snowballs and get ready for the next phase, because by now the big worms are already on their way. This is without a doubt the most deadly part of the fight, and honestly where I see most groups wiping, or at the very least losing a lot of your melee DPS. The mechanics are actually rather simple. Stay spread. If you get a debuff, move to someone with the opposite debuff. On the face of it, that is it. But firstly, what you need to understand is when you're facing the doors where the bosses come through, Acidmaw, which will be your kill target, if you follow this guide, will be spawning on the left and will be completely stationary. Dreadscale will be on the right and can be and should be moved. Whenever the worms submerge and move around underground and then come back up, they switch their mobility. So after a submerge, Acidmaw will now be able to move, but Dreadscale will be the stationary target. This rinses and repeats for every single submerge that happens. The most important thing you need to know here is how the debuffs work for each of them. The stationary worm will always use its debuff on the raid, whilst the mobile worm will always use his debuff on the tank. The debuffs that both of these bosses have is Acidmaw applies paralytic toxins, which makes you slower and slower until you're paralysed, whilst also ramping up in nature damage, and then Dreadscale applies a debuff called Burning Bile, which does a substantial amount of fire damage every 2 seconds in a 10-yard range. The good thing about the Burning Bile, though, is it can also remove the paralytic toxin if someone takes a tick from it. Before we get into exactly how you'll position and how you want to handle these debuffs, let's just cover the other mechanics that you need to know about. Whichever worm is stationary will do a sweep, which just knocks everyone back within 15 yards. This at first will be Acidmaw, then following each submerge it will swap worm, or Joemunga, but worm, big worms. The mobile worm will leave pools of slime on the floor, much like Grobulus in Nax. Simply move it out the puddles when they start getting too big, and melee can't hit the boss anymore. The mobile boss will also do a frontal cone called Molten Spew if it's Dreadscale, or Acidic Spew if it's Acidmaw. This is what makes it super important that when the tank is moving the worms out of the slime pool, you never ever face it towards the raid. Now let's talk about how you bring all this together, and there is actually numerous ways to handle this. First, you all want to full nuke Acidmaw. Get rid of this worm as soon as possible so you no longer need to worry about the paralytic toxin. You also want to limit the amount of people that will get the toxin. So you want your melee split into a left and right side, making sure that the two groups are further apart than 10 yards from each other, but also being 10 yards away from the tank. So it should form a triangle, basically, around Acidmaw. This means if one of your melee is chosen by Acidmaw to get paralytic spray, it limits the amount of people that will get the toxin. Your Rets can then bubble it off, your Rogues can cloak it, and basically just use any immunities to remove it without needing to run over to the Dreadscale tank to take a tick of the Burning Bile. Remember that at this moment in time, Dreadscale is mobile, so he can do the conal fire spray, so you want to stand to the side of the worm within 10 yards of the tank. It'll remove your toxin on the next pulse of damage, and you can go back to Acidmaw and carry on doing what you was doing. Now, I will include a link to some weak auras we set up specifically for this, because both the Acidic Spew and Molten Spew have a cast time. So if you're fast and react to the weak aura quick, you can rocket boots away from the rest of the melee before the cast finishes, and only you will get hit. This is going to be especially useful after the first submerge. This is because now it's the deadly Burning Bile that's going to spread across the raid, and the tank on Acidmaw will be the one that gets the paralytic toxin. Now, if your DPS is really high and you can guarantee you can kill each worm in a single submerge, so before the worm submerge, you can take one worm down, and when they come back up, you can definitely kill that worm before it submerges again. You absolutely can kill Dreadscale first. It's not something I would recommend because it's just added risk. You may get to the point where you're going to get a third submerge, which then means paralytic toxin can go on the raid again instead of just being on the tank. If you can take Dreadscale out just before or just after the first submerge, and then you can kill Acidmaw before it submerges again and the paralytic toxin's going to go on the raid, you can have your prop paladin that's tanking it bubble or DIM or whatever. It's definitely not something that we will be doing personally, and again, I don't see the vast majority of guilds doing it purely because of the DPS requirement, and really, it leaves very little room for error. But in the effort of being as informative as possible in these guides, it is an option. But assuming you killed Acidmaw first, you've now got Dreadscale, and you've probably just killed Acidmaw shortly, or 20 seconds, whatever, after they've submerged. Now you've got Dreadscale that can do Burning Bile, and instead of doing it on the tank like he did at the start before the submerge, now he can hit anybody in the raid. If this goes on a melee and you've got 4 or 5 people all stacked, they will die. All of them. Unless they've got massive cooldowns on. This is because as it goes out, it does an AoE around 10 yards, and each person will be doing that AoE not only to their self, but everyone around them. The timers on DBM are actually really reliable and super useful for knowing when Burning Bile and paralytic toxins are coming in, because trust me, if you're going to wipe, it's after the submerge when all your melee die to the first Molten Spew that goes out, and it's the Molten Spew cast that applies the Burning Bile. There's 3 ways you can approach this, and which way you decide I will leave up to you. Firstly, after the submerge, you watch the timer on Molten Spew, and when there's a few seconds left, all melee spread 10 yards, just like the ranged are. Wait for the spew to go out and then stack back in, nuking Dreadscale, assuming that Acidmaw's already dead. This is by far the safest way, and what we will do the vast majority of the time, because we run a melee heavy comp. The second way is to, again, like phase 1, make sure your melee groups are split, use a weak aura to track who is being targeted by Molten Spew, and if it's you, run straight through the worm with rocket boots to the wall. The worst thing that will happen here is the tank will get the debuff as well, which is absolutely fine. And also, because the worm is stationary, he won't be doing the conal damage, so you don't have to worry about that either. The third way is very similar to the second way, but forget about running out, you simply spread into 2 stacks of melee, 10 yards from each other, and every time Burning Bile is about to go out, use cooldowns, Pallas D-Sacs, Fire Res, Aura Masteries, anything you've got basically. I would actually combine both of these strategies and try to get out if you can with rocket boots, but at the same time having a cooldown rotation going with D-Sacs and AMs just in case that person is too slow, and change it to another 2 or 3 people. I cannot stress enough, if you're pushing for 50 attempts and trying to get tribute to insanity, rushing this particular phase, which only makes up for around 45 seconds of the fight, is utterly pointless. Have your melee spread out every 10 to 12 seconds so only one person gets hit by bile, they stay out and get healed while everyone else moves back in, rinse and repeat until he submerges again. Once dreadscale comes back up now, it's back to the debuff just going on the tank. You can make this fight so clean just by not worrying about dreadscale too much while he can cast Burning Bile on the raid. Get dreadscale finished off, hope that your melee haven't died because they didn't listen to this video, get yourself spread out and get ready for the last beast. Definitely the easiest beast. This beast is Icehowl. Honestly, if you got through Gormock on the worms, this is a piece of cake. Spread out for the first mechanic that we'll talk about, which is Arctic Breath. Icehowl will choose a random target and channel a conal breath at that person. Everyone hit by the breath will be frozen, so the more you spread, the less of you that will get frozen. You can blink out of this, bubble, and basically anything else that can remove stuns or cause you to become immune. Even the ret talent, Divine Purpose, should work. Say should, didn't actually try it, but it should work. He does a knockback, so melee, if you're just at max range, you will never get knocked back. The tank can just keep his back to the wall so he doesn't get knocked back either, and then periodically Icehowl will jump into the middle of the arena and do a massive crash. This is a perfect time to use a D-Sac from one of your paladins because it's a predictable large amount of damage, but assuming everything goes according to plan, you get plenty of time to heal everyone up during the time Icehowl is stunned, so there's no big deal really if a D-Sac gets missed, or even if you decide not to use them rotationally on these crashes. Once the boss is in the middle, he'll face someone and get ready to charge them. As long as you move away and everyone near you moves away, the boss will charge the wall instead of hitting the player that was once there, becoming stunned and taking extra damage, so it's time to nuke. Only attempt what I'm about to say if you're extremely brave, because it worked on the PTR. I can show you evidence of it working on the PTR. If you run directly at the boss, it doesn't register. He still runs through you and hits the wall. Again, this could be fixed. It could be fixed by the time it goes live. So please run away, run round the wall, you know, away out of the vision of the boss. But we was just running directly towards him and everything was fine. If you get hit by the boss, he won't become stunned. He won't take extra damage, but he will enrage and want to rip everyone's heads off. You can trank shot this off, so it's not too much of an issue. Don't panic and call a wipe. Just trank the enrage and carry on whilst noting down the griefer's name, who's going to get no loot and have a really bad rest of the raid. The only other thing to worry about here is the tank healing. The tank does get pretty battered because the whirl that the boss does that knocks people back would ordinarily give the tank a bit of breathing room. But because we're tanking in with the tank's back against the wall, it's just chunky hit into chunky hit. Just be aware and don't be scared to pop externals on the tank during this phase, like pain suppression, hand a sack, or basically whatever else you want. Good job, first boss down, get ready for some free loot from Jaraxxus. Like and subscribe. Goodbye.